Welcome to part 2 of Macedon Behind the Faction. Thank you everybody for supporting my first video so well. I am a new YouTuber and the response I got, I'm sure many veteran YouTubers wouldn't count it as much, but for me it was a big breakthrough and I just would like to thank you all. Now, in our last episode, Philip had just consolidated all of Macedonia, most of Thrace, and all of Greece into a kind of an empire where he had direct control over Macedonia, and over Greece and Thrace he had authority, shall we say. In this episode we're going to cover Philip's assassination and Alexander's early career. This was going to be a two-parter, but I've made the decision that this has to be a three-part video. Even summarized, it's a long story, and I think 3 videos should do it justice. So, the consummate diplomat Philip, during the time he was conquering the Illyrians and the Thracians, he consolidated, I've been using that word a lot, his alliance with the Epirots. Now, people call them the Epirots, but they were actually known as the Molossians. He married a Molossian princess called Olympias, or more commonly known as Angelina Jolie. This was quite an important alliance because Epirus is actually very similar to Macedon culturally. First of all, the Greeks considered both Macedon and Epirus as kind of just one step above barbarians. They didn't think much of them, but they thought, hey, they are better than those Illyrians and those Thracians, but not by much. Now, at first, this marriage was fantastic. I mean, they were very passionate lovers, but it began to cool very quickly, mainly because Olympias had a habit of bringing snakes into the bed, and Philip wasn't into that kind of kink, and that drove a real wedge, and things really came to a head. When Alexander was born, Olympias claimed that Zeus was the real father of Alexander. And of course, that's gonna really damage a guy like Philip's ego. And it never affected his relationship with Alexander, maybe towards the end of his life, but it's largely overstated that Alexander and Philip didn't get on. Alexander looked up to his father a lot. In fact, I would argue that Alexander's prime drive in life was to do better than Dad. And that came from a place of admiration. It was Olympias who hated Philip. And later in Philip's life, Olympias would definitely poison Alexander's opinion of his father. But not at first. You get all these anecdotes, like the famous scene where Philip wants to buy a horse from the Thracians, and it's this horse that just can't be tamed. Of course, Philip has to shoot his mouth off and says, well, if you want this horse so badly because Alexander wanted it, you'll have to tame it. And he tamed it and he got the horse. Philip apparently said, the world is not enough for you, Alexander. It's probably it is probably more of a legend, but it is based on a real event, as most of these legends are. Now, how did Philip die, being the main man in control? Well, it all started with the Greeks, as most things do. His alliance with the Greeks was always tenuous, so, being the consummate diplomat, he decided to take a Greek wife. and he married a girl called Eurydice. And Eurydice was a connected woman who was connected to one of the leading men of Athens, her uncle called Attalus. So this alliance would kind of pacify Athens, and Athens were the main instigators of trouble. They would stir up the rest of the Greek city-states. If you can control the Athenians, you can kind of get a handle on the whole of Greece. Now, at the wedding party, some sources say it was at the wedding party, some sources say it was just at an event celebrating Philip's conquest. Eurydice had become pregnant with Philip's baby, and Attalus, of course, got up drunkenly and made a toast. And his toast was that, I congratulate the new couple, and I'm so happy that Macedon and Greece can finally have an heir. An heir. Do you know who was in attendance? Alexander. He did not take kindly to that comment. He apparently picked up a gold goblet, threw it, and hit Attalus in the chest. And a big brawl broke out, and apparently Philip tried to make Alexander apologize. Alexander was not going to apologize, and Philip charged him. He was quite drunk. He charged him with a sword, but fell over his stool, and Alexander mocked his father. No, you didn't. Sorry, that was dumb. But he mocked his father, which is something you shouldn't do. He said, and this is the man that's going to lead you into Asia when he can't even cross the room. Which, you know, even now is quite a sick burn. Well, Philip's generals very wisely ushered Alexander from the room and said, listen, you better bounce for a while. Things are not hot for you right now. So Alexander went to his uncle in Epirus, the Molossian king Alexander I. And Olympias followed him. And from here, for some reason, Alexander went to Illyria, north. Now, it's not conclusively proven that he was doing this, but the popular theory is that Olympias said to Alexander, listen, babe, your father is definitely gonna disinherit you for the baby Greek. Shout out to my Crusader Kings 3 players out there. And it's probably better for you to go and recruit an army among the Illyrians, march into northern Macedonia, get some more troops, and depose your father and become king. Now, as I said, there's no concrete proof of that, but it's a pretty good working theory that he was doing that. But he didn't really need to. And this is where there's a lot of conjecture around the scholarship. Some people ask, well, I mean, did Philip ever intend to supplant Alexander? The answer is no, definitely not. Listen, Alexander led the right flank at the age of 16 in Philip's army at the Battle of Chaeronea. That huge battle that took place in Thessaly somewhere, I think it was near Lamia. That huge big battle, the whole right of Philip's army, which was a position of honor, by the way, was led by Alexander. No, I'm sorry. Alexander was earmarked as Philip's heir and only successor. Philip would have known this. Philip was Macedonian. Even if the Greeks thought that, we'll make Philip disregard his heir, Philip wouldn't have done that. Philip knew that the Macedonians don't give a crap about lineages and bloodlines and are you a Greek or are you this, are you that. They care about authority, they care about charisma. Why do you think he made Alexander fight with him? He wanted Alexander to earn the loyalty of his army, which he did. So for me, any suggestion that Philip was actually planning that is ludicrous. It's unrealistic and it shows an ignorance of ancient Macedonian culture, to be honest. Anyway, whether or not that was true, and I hope I've argued that it wasn't, that's what Alexander believed. Alexander believed that his place was untenable, but Philip negotiated with Alexander through his uncle, Alexander, the other Alexander, Alexander king of the Molossians, to come home and all will be forgiven. And all was forgiven. You know, the two patched things up. But I feel like Alexander lost a lot of trust for his father. And it goes a long way to show you. Trust takes years to build up, but can be lost in seconds. And I believe Alexander lost the trust of his father. I think his father always saw Olympias's influence on Alexander as a very negative thing. Now, that is evidenced by the fact that Philip immediately married his other daughter by Olympias to her own uncle, the king of Epirus. So, yeah, her name was Cleopatra, by the way, if that's not confusing enough. There's so many Cleopatras and Eurydices in Macedonian history, it's not funny. But Cleopatra, the full sister of Alexander, married her uncle, her mother's brother. And this was to shore up an alliance, so that, because Philip didn't know whether he could trust the Epirites after Olympias was there kind of poisoning them against him. And this kind of assured things. And almost like in a script of a bad movie, on the wedding day of this Epirate king and his daughter Cleopatra, Philip gets assassinated. Now, he gets assassinated by a guy called Pausanias, and the given reason for the assassination is that, well, Pausanias was one of Philip's lovers, and Attalus also loved Pausanias, but Pausanias said no to Attalus. Remember, Attalus is the Athenian here. But Philip forced Pausanias to be with Attalus, and Pausanias could never forgive Philip, so he stabbed him. That's one of the theories. Another theory is that Alexander and Olympias both teamed up and murdered Philip. Obviously not personally. Another theory is that it was actually King Alexander of Epirus and the new Queen Cleopatra of Epirus who planned the assassination. No one knows. All had cause. Alexander, I wouldn't even rule out Alexander or Olympias because, as I said, Alexander was feeling threatened. But the result was Alexander was immediately proclaimed king of Macedon, and the whole Greek baby thing was quietly sorted out by Olympias. Olympias was a mean, vicious bitch. There's no other word for it. She was incredibly ruthless. Now, what were Alexander's first actions as king? Well, the first thing he did was he wanted to press his father's conquests in Thessaly and in Greece. So he marched down to Thessaly, right? But Thessaly now refused to vote Alexander, the same powers that they had voted to Philip. remember, they made Philip the Targos of Thessaly. Alexander decided to wage a military campaign against the Thessalians. Now, the Thessalians raised an army, and they held the passes around Mount Olympus here that separate Macedonia from Thessaly and the rest of Greece. One thing you must understand about Alexander is that Alexander was not a big picture guy. Alexander was all about being in the moment, in the present. What can we do now to win? And this was his greatest strength, and as we'll learn in a later video, probably his greatest weakness as well. So what he did was, with the crack division of his army, they climbed around the mountain and they came up on the rear of the Thessalians. That's what she said. Sorry, I had to do it. And the Thessalians were so surprised that Alexander had did this that they just decided that maybe voting him the powers that they had voted his father was a good idea, and they did that. As this was happening, in Greece, Athens was stirring up a shitstorm, and they were saying, yeah, you know, Philip is dead, so technically we're all free. And as soon as Demosthenes, who was the leading figure in Athens, had finished that sentence, oopsie, the Macedonians are in Greece. He marched his whole army into Greece, and the Greek states were so surprised that they just immediately capitulated. Alexander called a meeting of the League of Corinth, because that's what the union was called. So in Corinth, he had himself elected as the Strategos Autokratikos, which is basically a fancy word for I own you bitches. So now, for the time being, Greece and Thessaly were taken care of. But whenever a Macedonian king dies, there is a threat from the outside peoples of Thrace and Illyria. Now, this goes to show you the sophistication of these so-called barbarians, that they had their ears to the ground and they knew when there was instability in Macedonia, and they could come in and do raids and make away with livestock and goods and all that great stuff. He marched his army from Greece all the way to Thrace, and he does that so fast that the Thracian tribes also immediately capitulate. But right across the border, more into modern day Bulgaria, I guess, you have a tribe called the Tribali. Here they're the Odrysians. The Tribali are here, but in truth the Tribali kind of inhabited this whole region. Now, I'm not saying that paradox are wrong at all, because in truth all these tribes were kind of mixed, you know, they didn't necessarily have set boundaries. Now the Tribalian king, Heemus, he opposed Alexander, and he did something very clever. He garrisoned his troops along these mountains here, the Balkan mountain range, and he gambled that Alexander can have the kind of lowland valleys and the woodlands, and he would just do what he always did. He would camp out in the mountains, and the Macedonians would go away. They would be content with Thrace, and they would go off and do other things. Alexander don't roll that way, baby. He climbed the mountains. This was one of his most famous battles, the Battle of Mount Heemus. Where's Mount Heemus? No one knows. It could be anywhere along this mountain range. But what happened was the Tribalians filled up carts with big boulders of rocks. And what they were going to do is, as the Macedonians were coming up this hill, they were going to push down these carts, and they were going to just flatten the soldiers. Alexander told his troops to march in loose formation, and when the carts approached with these big giant boulders, they were to either move to the side like loose ranks and let the carts pass, or they were to lie flat on the ground and cover themselves with their shields. Now, I don't know how true this is, but every source I read on this battle attests to this. I think the more likely scenario is that they just marched in loose formation and let the carts pass harmlessly next to them. But it could have happened, and I'll tell you why I think it happened, because Alexander time and time again will use very daring gambits. So Alexander conquered this region above from Thrace. He had humbled the Tribali. But next he marched into this region, and he saw that the Getae were very close to coming over the Danube and helping the Tribali. Now, he posted his men on the Danube riverbank, but the big problem was he couldn't actually ford the river. It's just too big, there's not enough crossing points. What he planned for was that ships would come in, they would sail up the Danube from its mouth, and they would transport the troops. That never happened. But do you think that stopped Alexander? No, you haven't been paying attention. He makes pontoon rafts out of tents, out of leather tents that his troops were using, and he crosses with a crack force of 5,000 heavy infantry and 2,000 cavalry. And the Getic tribes had way more than that. I think they had in the tens of thousands. But this totally stuns the Getans, who were facing off the Macedonian army on the opposite riverbank, and all of a sudden a flanking force is right behind them. This scared the bejesus out of them. So they surrendered. So now Alexander has not only confirmed all of his father's conquests, but he's actually increased Macedonian rule to the Danube, to this river here. Incredible. This is actually a part of Alexander's career that's not widely looked at, which I think is a shame, because he was doing incredible stuff here. Now, it was around this time that he got word that the Illyrians were not rebelling. They were never under Macedonian rule, but they were making inroads into Macedon. So he marched his army all the way here to Illyria. He held up the Illyrian forces in a town, I believe it's in this area, the siege of Pelium. Pelium is a fortress town that's never actually been found, but it's in modern-day Albania, and it was on the border with Epirus, so around this area. Now, Pelium was on a mountain height, and you can see this is a very hilly terrain. The Macedonian army occupied the valley. They chased the Illyrian army under a commander called Cleopatra in this mountain fortress. There was a relieving force under a commander called Glaucius coming to flank the Macedonians who were in this valley here. And you had a situation where Glaucius arrived and he posted his troops along the mountains, the exact same thing that the Tribalians tried to do with this mountain range. And the Macedonians were caught between a rock and a hard place. They had Glaucius here on these mountains, and in this fortress, let's say for argument's sake here, they had Cleopatra. Now, this is another amazing thing Alexander loved to do with his enemies: psychological warfare. What he did was he had his army march in formation and demonstrate these awesome maneuvers that he could make his army do. Now all of these phalangite troops are holding 16-meter long sarissa pikes that weigh a ton, I'm sure. With all their armor, it's not easy making that huge body of troops move as one, or as he would say, move as my own arm. And the Illyrians had just never seen this before. No Illyrians were capable of anything like this. So what they did was they started to come down from the heights, from the mountains. Looking at this, they were confused. They're like, well, are we fighting or are we parading? And when they had come down, Alexander gave the attack order, and boom! All the Illyrians scattered and they were no more threat. He conquered them. Now, it never rains, it pours, and those damn Greeks, they had stirred up another rebellion because they had got a false rumor that Alexander had somehow died. So Demosthenes, the main statesman in Athens, was stirring up the Greek cities and saying, well, Alexander's dead, we can all be free and we can all be happy and free and under Athens. Alexander was pissed. I mean, wouldn't you be? So he marched down here at the head of an army. Thebes, at this point the most powerful Greek state, rebelled. Alexander gave them a chance to recant their rebellion. They refused. Right, no more Mr. Nice Guy, it's fucking on. He tortures Thebes to the ground. Later he would come to regret this, but he did. It was easily described as his most barbarous act. I don't really think that's true. I think his most barbarous act was actually when he first became king, he killed or had anyone killed who remotely stood a chance to oppose him in his own family and extended family. The only one left alive was his half-brother, Philip Aridaeus. Aridaeus means the bewitched. They believed he was possessed by witches. This is why he could never inherit. You know, historians don't know what he had. They predict he had everything from cerebral palsy to autism spectrum disorder, but in truth he could have just been a bit lame in the leg. It didn't take much in those days. And truth be told, the only reason why Philip Aridaeus lived was probably because he was considered an invalid, so maybe it was a blessing. But also, it's not really fair to Alexander because there are reports that Alexander was genuinely quite fond of Philip. So he dealt with Thebes, burnt to the ground, and then he thought, you know, you Greeks cannot be trusted. He takes the city of Chalcis, Eretria, and Corinth, and he garrisons those cities, and those cities become known as the fetters of Greece. Now, fetters is a fancy schmancy word for handcuffs, shackles, you know. So this is what they were. This was how they would ensure that Greece was going to behave in the future. Now, with all that done, Alexander could finally look to conquering the expansive the expansive Achaemenid Persian Empire under Darius III. Now, before I go, I will say a word on why Alexander thought he could achieve this. First of all, his dad had always planned to invade Persia, that's true, but his dad probably would have been content with Ionia here, or possibly even Ionia and Sardis, which is about a third of Asia Minor, which is this peninsula here. Alexander always wanted to conquer the whole thing, which, you know, he would have fantastic success at, but we'll cover that later. But why did he think that he could? Well, I believe he read a book by Xenophon, a historian at the time, called the Anabasis. Now, the Anabasis told a story about Spartan and, I believe it was Spartan, Athenian and Theban mercenaries, because the Greeks always worked as mercenaries. As soldiers, they were hotly in demand all over the world. And what was happening in Persia, the Achaemenid dynasty, was having trouble. The king Artaxerxes was being opposed by his younger brother Cyrus. Now, Cyrus had hired a whole bunch of Greek mercenaries, and they met, I believe it was around here, around this right bank of the Tigris, somewhere, it's not really known. But they met in battle, and Cyrus the younger, the rebel, actually won, but he died, so he couldn't pay his mercenaries, and Artaxerxes refused to. Now, Artaxerxes lost the battle, so here's an odd situation. He lost the battle but won the war because the only other guy died, and he refused to pay these 10,000 mercenaries. But he gave them a choice. He said, well, you could fight for me for free, or you can die. And they were like, yeah, we're gonna take our chances, thank you. Artaxerxes was like, You know, because you're in the middle of fucking nowhere, man. Where are you going? Greece is like all the way there. They were like, nah, I'm gonna take my chances. And they actually marched from Mesopotamia all the way to Lebanon, and they caught ships back to Greece. And all the way they were harried by Persian troops, and they could not beat them. Now, Alexander took a big lesson from this. The lesson he took here was that Persian soldiers, Persian infantry, cannot stand up to Greek heavy infantry. But I believe that's the thing that convinced him to actually go all in and conquer the Persian Empire. But that is a story for another video. As I said, there will be one more installment of Behind the Faction Macedon. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment and subscribe. That's very important, because if you comment, you can tell me what faction you would like me to do, and I'll definitely do it. Might not do it straight away, but I will do it. Yeah, as I said, thank you everyone for your support, and I'll see you next time.